Hello, I'm Lucy.
And I'm Michelle.
Welcome to another episode of Tudoriferous, the biographical podcast that examines lives in the Tudor era.
And today, not lives, but astrology.
Astrology, a book, another book. Henry VII's book of astrology.
Yeah, the fact that there's a book.
Well, there's lots of books, I think.
Yes.
Then, as now, there are lots of books on astrology.
Yeah, Catherine de Medici, in 2 series from now, she had Nostradamus as her astrologer, probably the most famous astrologer of all time, I would think.
Well, I'm not sure he's on the list, but we'll have to put him on the list.
Yeah, for that year. Oh, he'd be an interesting one, actually.
He would.
I'm assuming since his books still exist and everybody seems to think he predicted everything.
He'd probably predict that he'd be on our podcast.
Yes. Yeah, we'll have to read his books and see it.
Exact date and everything.
Do we have Henry VII's astrologer's name?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
Yeah, we come across him for a little while. He wasn't very good.
Was that John Dee?
No, he's, well, he'd have liked to have been Elizabeth's, but he was a little bit out on a limb, poor Mr. D.
Okay.
Oh. Well, a lot of our old friends do appear in this episode. It's a real who's who of people we've already had.
Okay.
And that's why I really enjoyed researching it, because I kept saying, oh, it's him. Oh, great.
Instead of being anonymous names in a book now, we're like, oh, we know this person.
Yes.
Yeah.
He's whizzed past us at some point. Yeah. First thing, we shouldn't be looking at astrology in this period as a clash between superstition and reason. That's an argument for today.
Yeah, that's weird that they just assumed.
It was considered as much of a science as astronomy or maths.
But it was banned, wasn't it?
Well, it's one of these grey areas, I think.
Yeah.
It's one of these things which gets banned, but everybody does it.
Right.
I think. But the argument then was, is this subject contrary to the teachings of God? And given the numbers of clergymen who had an interest in astrology, I think the answer they came to was probably
Not?
no. A tentative no. Henry VII's Book of Astrology is a very interesting and beautiful document known as the British Library manuscript Arundel 66.
Oh, nice title. That makes it very clear exactly what it's supposed to be about.
Well, I'm going to call it Arundel 66, just to differentiate.
It should be more descriptive.
Well, it's not a descriptive, is it? It's a library catalogue thing, isn't it? Yeah. It's been dated to the year 1490. There's some doubt as to whether this manuscript was made for Henry VII, but most historians agree that it was, so I think we'll go along with that. I'm sick of being revisionist.
Okay.
Let's just go with the flow for once.
What's the other option?
There's no other option that I know of as to who else it might have been made for. It's just whether or not it was made for him.
Well, you sent me pictures, and it is awfully detailed to be for somebody else. Like the illustrations, the illuminations on it are a lot.
I would say it was 99% certain it was Henry.
Yeah.
And the reasons for it that I'll go into in a minute for it not being him don't add up for me.
No, for that much detail to be done. Gosh, could you imagine the length of time that took?
Oh, it's a beautiful thing.
Wow. Yeah.
The scribe, and we know the scribe's name, his name is John Wellys, Wellys, probably Willis.
Oh, okay.
He wrote in it, quote, "This book by Guido Bonatti of Forlì," we come across Forlì a lot in our Patreon episode, and that bit makes up the largest part of the manuscript, as we'll see in a minute, was finished in the year of Christ, 1490, on the 30th day of June, 12 hours and 24 minutes.
Oh.
Compiled and brought up to date by me, John Wellys, in the 4th year of King Henry VII and the 5th year of the pontificate of our most holy Father in Christ, Pope Innocent IV, unquote. And this seems pretty emphatic to me, except obviously it means Innocent VIII and not Innocent IV. But as someone who constantly gets the names of kings wrong, I have a certain sympathy with him now.
But we edited it out.
Yeah, he's had 500 years to edit that out. Lazy journalism.
Oh, dear.
And the doubt that it was meant for Henry seems to lie in the fact that Henry was thought to be too intelligent to believe in this stuff by some historians, which I think is ridiculous and
I think so
very
too.
21st century view.
Yes.
And I assume it's because Henry made laws against astrology in that do as I say, not as I do type way.
Yeah, well, Elizabeth
laws
had
are
those
often
laws.
made. Yeah.
And she still had astrologers. Heck, they chose when she was going to be coronated.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think there'd be any coronation without somebody checking for an auspicious day.
Yeah.
We came across Lucretia Borgia's wedding, didn't we? That
Right.
Ascanio Sforza chose the day after
Yeah.
checking that it was going to be all right. And you don't just check the weather; you check which is what you think is the most important thing. Will it rain? But I have a book of the statutes of Henry VII, originally printed by Caxton in 1489, and I scoured that book looking for laws against astrology, and I couldn't find anything.
Oh.
I think I must have read it in a secondary source, and I can't remember which, and just assumed that it was right, which is always a dangerous thing to do.
Yeah.
Or not all the statutes are in Caxton's book. I'm not sure. I can't remember
Both
where I
impossible.
first came across that he'd made that law.
I don't know.
It's one of these things we've said so often that it became true, and I don't know where I got it.
Really don't like it when I've done that. Like, I'm sure I've read this somewhere. Where? How many books have you read now?
Yes.
Oh, my goodness.
The other reason that historians thought that Henry couldn't have owned this manuscript was that he was too mean to buy illuminated manuscripts. He preferred printed books because they were cheaper.
Oh, dear.
But this book could have been a gift.
I was going to say, gifts.
Almost certainly would have been a gift if he
Yes.
had it. We've no proof that Henry actually commissioned it, so it could have come to him out of the blue. But I don't think Henry was stingy with money. He wanted lots of money,
Yes.
but he also spent lots of money.
Yes.
So, but if it were a gift, the donor must have known that it'd be well received by Henry. He wouldn't give him a book if he thought he had no interest in astrology.
Yeah, that would be pointless.
Yeah, I mean, if you were to give me a book on astrology, I'd be polite, but I would also be thinking, oh, she doesn't know me at all. That's going straight to the charity shop.
Oh. Think of it as current research based on what we're reading now.
True. But if there was a generous donor, who were they? We'll look at that in a minute.
Yeah, a lot of them are often inscribed with who it is gift to.
It's quite the... One of the reasons I enjoyed researching this was it's quite the detective story.
Oh. Okay.
Yeah. This book is bigger than similar books and is illustrated with numerous very beautiful miniatures.
Mm-hmm.
The texts in the volume fall into three categories. Astrology, divination, represented here by geomancy, and geomancy is making predictions based on marks on the ground and patterns formed in rocks, etc. What we would probably now call folding and faulting in our modern geological way. And political prophecy, designed to bump up the credibility of the Tudors. So all of these are involved in predicting the future. I always thought that's the dodgy bit about religion. It's the predicting the future bit.
Yes.
It's the free will, not free will.
Yeah, because only God could tell the future, but you're trying to... yeah.
You're trying to preempt him, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Or you could argue, I'm just reading what he's written in the stars.
That's precisely what they did in the Book of Nature, which was God's writing.
Yeah. I love how you can just see the lines on the book that they put on to keep the writing even.
Oh, you'd have to do that, wouldn't you? Otherwise you'd sort of
I've seen a
head
couple
downwards at the end.
Yeah, I've seen a couple of different options for that. So this one's actually lined. Others, they used what looked kind of like a spur. And they'd run it lightly along the page, and it would just leave little, like, indents that you would write over top, so you didn't end up with those lines left over. But this is really pretty.
We don't know where it was when it was first scribed, either for or by Henry VII, but it was later in the hands of Henry Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, and he gave it to the Royal Society in 1667. Other books given as gifts to Henry's were dripping with Tudor iconography, red and white roses and portcullises. But this one isn't, which is odd.
No, it's
got dragons, a lot of dragons.
Oh.
But not much else, which is another reason why people have doubted that it was meant for Henry.
Well, it does have the roses, but it's the red rose.
I wonder if it was originally meant for somebody else, and then things change. Well, I don't know if by the time we get to 1490, he's been there for 5 years. If it had been intended for Edward or Richard or somebody, and they thought, oh, great, I've got to start again now.
Maybe, but then it would be the white rose for the Yorkists.
Colour in all the roses. Yeah, colour them all in. Arundel 66 is a substantial manuscript. It would have been very expensive. And it's been artistically produced in the Burgundian style, that oh so popular style.
Oh, everything was the Burgundian style.
Yes. It's separated into 7 books. Book 1 has tables for making an almanac by the astronomer John Killingworth. I tried to find out more about John Killingworth, but there's very little information about our John Killingworth. I knew I'd come across the name Thomas Killingworth was the sidekick of Edmund de la Pole. I knew that Killingworth was leaping out at me from somewhere. Yep. Book 2 is an illustrated catalogue of 45 constellations with their celestial latitudes and longitudes adjusted for the meridian of Oxford.
Oh.
So they may have been calculated on the continent and then tweaked.
Yes.
Once they got over to England.
We should probably mention that the meridian is the vertical line from the North Pole to the South Pole going through a specific city. Or, in this case, a university.
In a city.
In a city, yes.
Book 3. The 13th century Italian astrologer Guido Bonatti of Forlì's book, An Introduction to Astrology. Sounds terribly modern, doesn't it? An introduction to astrology.
Does.
A short history of astrology. Astrology for dummies, something like that.
Yeah, it's your first year university program. Here's your first textbook.
And this is a big chunk of the manuscript, running to 10 books in itself. I looked up Bonatti, since he's such a major part of the book, and he is an interesting character. He found himself in the 8th circle of Dante's hell.
Uh-oh.
That's reserved for fortune tellers and diviners.
Right.
And there, the damned souls who have tried to divine the future languish with their heads on backwards, facing their past and their eyes blinded with tears. Which doesn't actually sound as bad as some of Dante's punishments, does it?
No.
Not pleasant, but yeah. You know a certain amount about Bonatti and his family. All of it absolutely true. His father lived to the age of 107.
Really?
An uncle lived to the age of 120.
Oh my goodness.
His mother claimed to have known someone who gave birth to a cat.
Oh, of course she did. Of course she did.
That's a woman, not another cat.
Great.
Some of these stories, or stroke lies, are really convoluted. Bonatti claimed to have travelled to Arabia, where he saw a huge astrolabe covered in images of the side of the zodiac, and the image of Scorpio showed an Ethiopian holding dung up to his nose, since, according to Bonatti, those born under Scorpio ascending love the smell of dung. What? So there you go. You don't see that when you're told you're going to meet a tall, dark stranger and go on a journey. You're not told you'll love the smell of dung.
No.
Well, I'm not a Scorpio, so I'm all right there.
Me either.
It actually seems very unlikely he went to Arabia, so he must have had a very fertile imagination. On more solid ground, he seems to have worked for the Holy Roman Emperor, and in fact, he alone, out of all the astrologers, foresaw the conspiracy against the emperor. Or at least that's what he tells us.
Which emperor?
I don't know, because we're gone back quite a way now, so
yeah.
It was a medieval one.
Okay.
We have several occasions where Bonatti tells us he was at such and such a battle or helping such and such a leader, when documentary evidence tells us he was actually elsewhere.
This is a good start to whether or not your book tells the truth.
It's very annoying, isn't it, when you tell one story and there's documentary evidence.
Yes.
From about 700 years saying, right, And his stories changed constantly. Most of Bonati's predictions concerned leaders saying, shall I win such and such a battle? So Bonati would tell them. It's not as if he had a 50-50 chance or anything, is it? Following a consultation with Bonati, one leader decided to lift the siege of a fortress. And presumably he was quite pleased with the outcome, but, he might have won. There's no control group. We can't find out whether he would have won or not. And so, although this man might seem like a complete charlatan, liar and fantasist to us,
yes,
the fact that he was taken seriously in his own day might explain why he took up such a hefty chunk of Henry VII's manuscript.
Was he taken seriously by people who actually knew him, though, personally?
I don't know. Maybe it's because he spoke to leaders and told them what to do, that's the sort of thing you'd put in a book.
Yes.
That was destined for a leader.
Yeah.
But he could predict whether someone would win a battle or not. It's useful stuff, isn't it?
Very.
Book 4, there's just some more tables. Book 5, a copy of prophecies from Geoffrey of Monmouth's book, History of the Kings of Britain, for what that's worth. And he translated the prophecies of Merlin from Welsh to Latin, and it told of the coming of a red dragon, meaning obviously the Tudors, although Geoffrey of Monmouth wouldn't have known that. And it obviously expedient for Henry VII to promulgate the idea that the Tudors were descended from the world of Merlin. Mm-hmm. But how much he actually believed it himself, I'm not sure we'll ever know. It was useful to believe it, wasn't it?
Yeah.
He may have seen himself as the fulfilment of prophecy, because remember way back in Jasper Tudor's episode, the Welsh bards were singing about this man who was going to come and fulfil the prophecy.
Yeah.
And for some reason, they decided it was Henry VII. Anyway, it's all good PR. And that is why this document is spattered with images of red dragons. Because Merlin prophesied that the red dragon would defeat the white, symbolising the victory of the Britons over the Saxons, or Lancaster over York.
Man, that's handy.
Yeah. Isn't it nice when it all fits together?
Yeah.
And shows that you should be king after all. And this prophesied that one of the descendants of Cadwallader would return and reign over a united country, a bit like King Arthur. And if you can't guess who they're getting at there, I refer you to our episode on Bernard Andre. Book 6 was a set of geomancy tables compiled by Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester. And Humphrey's court had been... There ought to be more Humphreys, I think. Mm-hmm. His court had been a centre for alchemists, astrologers and necromancers.
Ooh, necromancers. That you can't put a good spin on that in any way.
It's not as bad as it seems.
Really?
It's more like spiritualism.
Oh, okay.
It's not
digging up
raising
bodies.
The dead. Yes. Or apparently Dungeons and Dragons, isn't it? Raising dead bodies and using them as weapons or something I read.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not that.
Okay.
No, it's talking to the dead.
Okay.
Sort of, yeah. Humphrey's wife, Eleanor Cobham, was accused of compassing the king's death using astrology, which is never a good thing to be accused of. And the last book in the manuscript, Book 7, some prophecies by Robert of Bridlington, Brigitta of Sweden, and Merlin Silvestris. Robert of Bridlington was a prior of the Order of the Augustine Canons, and he led a saintly life and made predictions. Brigitta of Sweden had visions about the war between France and England and had sent an envoy to try and stop the conflict. I see her as a sort of medieval Greta Thunberg, really, so I have a visualiser in my head. And Merlin Silvestris, I couldn't find out much about him, but it's just a great name.
His name is Merlin.
Merlin of the Woods, I think, isn't it, Silvestris? Yes. And these emphasise that Henry is the saviour of the country, the heir of Brutus or Cadwallader, who will unite the country and bring peace, the usual Tudor spiel. And the whole point of all this was to prove the prophetic and mythic origins of the Tudors. Of course they got a right to rule. It's written.
Yeah. It's been written for a very long time.
Yes, well, it's not just about predicting the future, it's also about justifying the past. We don't know an awful lot about astrology in England at this time. We know much more about it on the continent. England has been described as an astrological backwater to join all the other backwaters that England was. It can't get further back, I don't think.
Musical, culture, courtliness.
But this manuscript shows more knowledge and more interest than might otherwise have been assumed. We're assuming that to be given a book like this, Henry must have had an interest in astrology. But one historian suggested that the book was given to him to show England's achievements in astronomy, as well as astrology. Look, we're not a backwater anymore.
We learned science.
Yes. So we'll look at 3 people who might have had an input into this manuscript. There's no way of knowing either way, but these men had the expertise, and they were there, which is often all we have to go on with these things. So, yeah, it is quite a detective story deciphering what's going on in this manuscript and who's behind it. But we've already come across all 3 of these people before. Henry was the first English monarch to employ a court astrologer, William Parron. Yeah, to employ one.
Oh.
You had freelancers wandering around the court, but apparently his was William Parron is the first employed specific court astrologer.
On the employee rolls. Yeah, he's on the book. Weird.
Henry's son would then consider the employment of astrologers as entirely natural, but for Henry VII it was a statement of his interest and belief in the subject.
Okay.
And as we say, he wasn't the first to be intrigued by astrology, it had always been there. But interest in astrology in English court had risen in the reign of Henry VI, when several horoscopes were drawn up for the king, most of which contradicted each other.
I guess in uncertain times you reach for anything that will give you an answer.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah.
We came across Parron in Ralph Wilford's episode, salving Henry's conscience when he told him it was better for a few to die than for the whole country to suffer. Mm-hmm. So if you want to kill Edward Plantagenet and Perkin Warbeck, knock yourself out.
Oh, gosh.
Which Henry thought, oh, great, I will. Remember, this man is his astrologer, not his confessor.
Yeah.
So why might it be Parron who compiled this Arundel manuscript for the king? He had given the king 2 similar books, decorated in the same style. And if the identification is accurate, he's actually in the book, kneeling next to the king.
Oh.
But he couldn't have afforded to have got a book of this style scribed himself. He just didn't have that sort of money.
Right.
Although he was astrologer royal, quote, the king extended only limited patronage to him, unquote, which I took to mean he didn't pay him very often.
Yes. Twice in your entire life.
I don't think he deserved it, really. I don't mean he didn't deserve this bad treatment. I don't think he deserved to get any money for what he did. Parron came to England in the 1480s and made several successful predictions. Oh. And how do we know this? He told us so.
After the fact?
Oh, I should imagine so. He wouldn't have known they were successful until after the fact. In order to ingratiate himself with Henry, he presented him with De Astrorum Succincte Vi Fatale, or Concerning the Deadly Power of the Encircling Stars, which is now in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. And this book had 2 distinct missions. So it's getting a bit like the 1001 Nights.
Yeah.
Thing, isn't it? We're talking about the Arundel book, and in the Arundel book, Parron appears with his book, and in this book... But this book had 2 distinct missions. The first was to convince Henry that he needed a professional on his side to combat the deadly power of the stars. In other words, give us a job.
Oh, please, I need money.
Yes.
And I have no actual skills.
No. Well, one outcome of this deadly celestial power was the death of the princes in the tower.
Oh.
Because the lives of royalty could hang on a thread. Couldn't it, Henry?
Yeah.
Couldn't it?
Yeah.
So you need to be forewarned of danger.
Yeah.
Don't you? And we know rather more about Perrin's application to Henry to offer his services than we do of Henry's replies to them. I should imagine that Henry's replies were probably 1 or 2 words. Perrin claimed to be a physician, doctor of medicine, professor of astrology, and doctor of arts, although there was no evidence of him being any of these things. I'm not saying that he wasn't, but there's no evidence. But there often isn't when these people appear in court, especially from overseas.
Sorry, I'm shaking my head. They can't see me shake my head. Like, no, the answer is no.
The fact that astrology was studied alongside medicine shouldn't surprise us, because it's part of everything being linked.
Yeah.
The stars and our bodies.
Go back to
as above, so
the
below.
Human thought, or the Tudor Thoughts episode.
Yes. Being an Italian humanist in the English court at this time came with its own kudos, because we saw how John Damian, who was Italian, possibly French, maybe Turkish, was welcomed into the Scottish court by James IV, just turning up saying, "Look, I'm Italian, I'm a humanist."
Yes.
They thought, "Oh, great, come on in." The second mission of the book, Perrin gave Henry, was to defend astrology rationally and theologically against those who were speaking out against it. And presumably Perrin was thinking that if you have the king on your side, you're less likely to be burnt at the stake as a witch or a heretic.
Yes.
Perrin was very careful to defend astrology and to stress his respect for the church. Being an astrologer at this level was fraught with danger.
Yeah, it would be like walking a tightrope.
Yeah.
Not the safest occupation to choose.
Perrin's equivalent in the court of Charles VIII, Simon de Farre, was accused of sorcery, and his extensive library of astrological works was confiscated.
And burned?
They might have been burnt. He wasn't.
Oh, thank goodness.
So he was sort of lucky.
Whew.
But,
well, it depends. Was he executed in a different horrible way, just not burnt?
No, I don't think he was.
Okay,
I didn't come across that. The book I read said he was fortunate that his punishment wasn't worse.
Okay.
By 1503, Perrin's royal employment seems to have fizzled out. And that was largely because he predicted that Elizabeth of York would live well into her 80s.
Right.
And she'd just died.
Right.
If your job is making predictions and you get something so very wrong,
yeah,
it's not surprising your employer would like to wash their hands of you.
Yeah.
His prediction for Henry was that he'd live to be 100. But I suppose, since it's really dodgy to compass the king's death, if you push it forward a century...
then you're safe. Ooh. The king asks you, when am I going to die?
Please don't ask me that.
I am not.
You're never going to die?
Yeah.
His prediction for Arthur in 1502 states, quote, "The illustrious Arthur, Prince of Wales, will be safe and triumphant," unquote. He died the same year.
He's lucky he didn't get burnt at the stake at that point.
He really is. Obviously, he had an eye to the main chance, because when Arthur died, he sent Henry VII a treatise about the excellent fortune of Prince Henry.
Oh, my goodness.
Okay, I got the last one wrong, but this time... I would have sent him out the court and said, "Look, you are just jinxing this.
Yeah.
Every time you say something's going well, a member of my family dies."
God.
Astrologers had their excuses ready. I mean, you have to, really, don't you? It was very difficult predicting the life expectancy for individual people, apparently, because they might be susceptible to the even greater astrological influences on war, disease, or famine. I would have thought that would be part of the remit of your job.
Yes.
To factor in those elements.
Yes.
You can't say you'll live to be 100 unless you get ill, starve to death, or die in a battle.
Yeah. How can you not see that those things are going to happen? Those kill a lot of people. Isn't there a lot of energy or something around those that you should be able to see it easier?
Well, evidently not. Yeah. Perrin's interest in printing annual predictions did a lot to make astrology less exclusive. His almanacs were printed by Wink and de Word.
Ooh.
Almanacs contained more information than just astrological predictions, so the rise of their popularity isn't necessarily a greater interest in astrology, because they also contained guides for the agricultural year. And those were considered very important by everyone. I was just listening to excellent podcast, The Rest is History, about the first Chinese emperor, Qin, and he destroyed all books and their writers.
Oh.
Yeah, quite nasty. Except for agricultural guides. And I think Rome did something similar in Carthage.
Jeez. Why? I don't know, but it's interesting that we still have the Farmer's Almanac.
Yeah, I wonder how many actual farmers read these things.
Oh, I don't know. But the fact that it's still out there being published means that somebody's reading them. Enough people for it to continue to be a book being printed.
Yeah. It's one of these things you don't want to be the one who pulls the plug on it, really, do you?
Yeah, hold on. I'm looking up if there is one for this year. Yep, it's called The Old Farmer's Almanac, and you can still buy it. I'm looking at the long-range weather predictions on this year's Farmer's Almanac, and it says it's cool and rainy where I am, and it is not cool, and it has not been raining for quite a while. That's hilarious. You got it fully wrong.
Mind you, that's a long-range one, is it?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, just today, they've been telling us it's going to rain virtually every hour.
Yeah. Yes.
It's still beautiful blue skies out there. Anyway, that's Mr. Parran, the great astrologer. The next possible compiler of the Arundel manuscript is a man who was chaplain to Edward IV, warden of Merton College, Oxford, and bishop of successively Rochester, Chichester, and London. But we came across him faking a suicide and putting a dead body on trial. It's Richard Fitzjames. Just when you think this man can't get any worse, I've discovered recently that he was Edmund Dudley's executor.
Oh! He was a duke.
And you will be proud of me. I've been on an excursion.
Oh!
I went to the church where Fitzjames was rector to find out what information they had there.
And?
None.
Oh!
Practically none. His name is on the roll of rectors of Aller Church. So the information I got is right. He was the rector of Aller Church. So I took a picture of that. But Aller doesn't seem to want to celebrate the fact at all.
No.
By bringing attention to it. Most churches have leaflets you can get which tell you the history of the church. But Aller doesn't.
We don't want to tell you. It wasn't nice.
Well, you can understand them not wanting to claim Fitzjames. This is even weirder because Aller has a greater claim to fame as well. When Alfred the Great defeated Guthrum in the Battle of Edington, Alfred insisted that Guthrum should become a Christian.
Yes.
And be baptised at Aller Church.
Oh.
Not the one that's there now. I mean, that's very old, but not that old. But the font, apparently, is the original one.
Okay.
So, yeah, I mean, that's huge, I would say.
Yeah.
And
they don't have their... That's
nothing,
a shame.
no mention of it. Yeah, I found it all on the internet.
Shame.
I went to the actual church. It is a lovely church, though. It's worth visiting. Anyway, Fitzjames was considerably wealthier than Parran, and so could have afforded to commission the Arundel manuscript. The reason Fitzjames is considered is that there are a couple of instances of his heraldic emblems popping up in the book, including the dolphin embowed. And I looked up this symbol, and I noticed that the dolphin is also the emblem of the Dauphin of France, which makes sense. Dauphin means dolphin. And that's why some people have linked the manuscript with Louis of Orleans, which we'll come to in a minute. But the Dauphin's dolphin is more standing on its tail than embowed. Embowed means that sort of breaching when they leap out of the water.
Yeah,
and their
horizontal.
backs are bent. But Fitzjames did have the dolphin embowed all over the buildings that he endowed.
How do you end up with the dolphin as your symbol? How do they pick these things?
Well, often it's a pun, isn't it? But not a pun. Fitzjames. I can't make dolphin out of that at all. Fish James? No.
I don't know.
Well, we may be thinking, what's a bishop doing donating books on astrology?
Yes.
Surely he shouldn't be dabbling in the occult.
Yeah.
Erasmus called him, quote, immoderately superstitious, unquote.
Uh-oh.
He's anything but the only clergyman to be interested in astrology. Also, as we know, he's a complete nut job, this bloke, isn't he? So you would expect anything from him.
And we've seen how many people get a bishopric that aren't in any way members of a clergy.
Yeah. Fitzjames built a zodiac arch at Merton College, Oxford. And in it, Pisces is shown as the dolphin embowed.
Is it still there?
It is. Ooh. It is. It's the one between the warden's room and the hall. And it's decorated in the Burgundian style.
Of course it is.
And the sides of the zodiac are the bosses on the ceiling. Like we saw with John Morton's big fat face in Peer Regis Church. But however immoderately superstitious he might have been, the fact that he was putting signs of the zodiac and what's now still called the Fitzjames Arch at Merton College doesn't necessarily imply an obsession with astrology, because the zodiac denoted the passing of time as much as anything, and could often be found on religious buildings. However, he did cast a horoscope to work out the most propitious date to build the arch. Merton College was renowned for maths and astronomy, and by this time they were starting to make astrology respectable, so they were probably quite happy with their astrology arch.
Yeah. I doubt they think astrology is respectable now.
I haven't checked the prospectus, but I doubt astrology is on the curriculum anymore. I hope not. Well, not only did he use astrology to decide the best time to lay the foundation stone for a college building, but he also used divination to find lost property, which, if that includes treasure, would later be made illegal and actually became a capital offence.
What? Why?
I'm not 100% sure. I think it's so that you can't break into somewhere, steal stuff, and then claim to have found it by use of divination. I don't know. It's one of these laws where you think, how often did that happen to make a law worthwhile? But maybe it was happening all the time. I don't know. Well, if you are planning to build something and you want to know the most auspicious day to do it, you can consult Bonati's Introduction to Astrology in this manuscript. It's really very simple. You don't consider the fixed stars, only the planets, so that whittles it down considerably. But you must take into account the moon and the lord of the house in which it's situated.
Which moon?
The moon. Our moon.
We have two.
We have two moons?
Yeah. Yes, we do.
Do you live on Tatooine or something?
No. The second moon is a quasi-satellite known as Kamo'alea.
Well, let's assume he means the big shiny one. You're going to tell me it doesn't shine now, aren't you?
Albedo.
You have to, as well as the fourth house and its lord, and the second house and its lord, you've got to take into account. But that stands to reason. But I'm sure I need hardly tell you, you must not place any of the major signifiers underground, because that would really delay the construction of the building. So there you go. That's instructions from Mr. Bonati of Fawley on when to build a house. And I must admit, I would just read through that and then think, oh, to hell with it, I'm just going to start it now. Right, the third possible writer of this book.
Oh.
Another astrological character in Henry's court who might have commissioned the Arundel manuscript. He was a Welsh physician. In fact, he was physician to Margaret Beaufort and to Henry himself. And he was the doctor who conveyed messages between Margaret Beaufort and Elizabeth Woodville when they were conspiring that Henry should become king and marry Elizabeth of York. Lewis of Caerleon. He had studied at Cambridge and Padua. And at Padua, astrology was definitely part of the medical curriculum. When he returned to England, he spent some time as prisoner in the Tower due to his conspiracy to topple Richard, and he was probably released following Bosworth. Then he became very much Team Henry. He was made a Knight of the King's Arms at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. he owned a lot of astrological works, and we still have notes made by him in a rather chaotic way in these books. And as a chaotic note-taker myself, I was rather pleased about that.
Okay, so explain to me what a chaotic note is.
So I suppose it's one of the sort of things that I do when you suddenly think, oh, hang on a minute, and out of the blue you think of something and jot it down in the margin or on the cover or something.
That doesn't quite make sense with that book or something? Or the paragraph?
Probably only makes sense to him. And probably doesn't make sense a week later if he's anything like me. And you look, you suddenly think, what on earth is that? I'm sure it was so important. Lewis accurately predicted the solar eclipses of 28th of May 1481 and 16th of March 1485, the latter of which was calculated during his imprisonment in the Tower of London. The prediction of solar eclipses always goes down well, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's a good little show to put on, isn't it?
Especially since it is calculable.
Yes. If it doesn't work, you look a bit foolish, but it should do. In 2020, a manuscript of Lewis was brought by the British Library for £300,000.
Oh.
With his chaotic notes. It had been originally sold to a foreign buyer, but was then prohibited from leaving the country. So there we are, we still love Lewis. Henry's interest in astrology reached its height between 1486 and 1500. That may have been coincidence. I mean, we've all had passions for things in our lives that were sort of dropped. Mm-hmm. I used to be passionate about the ukulele. I never picked the thing up anymore. But this was a time for negotiations for the wedding between Arthur and Catherine of Aragon. It seems less likely that it was a coincidence because astrology and astronomy were a central part to the planning of the celebrations and pageants around the wedding. There are plenty of allusions to the stars, particularly in the pageants. I read several of them. They weren't actually all that interesting, and I did wonder whether the people at the time found them interesting, or whether they were just waiting for the wine fountain to be switched on.
They're waiting for the wine fountain.
I'd have thought it went over the heads of most of the spectators. Arthur was equated to the constellation Arcturus, and Catherine with Ursa Minor. I can see Arthur Arcturus.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure why Catherine and Ursa Minor. Unless his pet name for her was Little Bear, I don't know. But the interest in astrology may reflect the tension in the English court. The insecurity felt by both Henry VII, given his lack of legitimacy, the fate of the two recent kings, and the fact that those pretenders were constantly circling, and by the courtiers whose way of life was only secure as long as they pleased the king. So there's nothing like insecurity to make you grasp at straws.
Yeah.
So suddenly everyone's thinking, I really need to know what's going to happen in the future, because it's just sort of, at the moment, it's terrifying.
Yeah. After you've paid a £500,000 recognizance bond.
Yes. Why am I being called to London to talk to these people?
Yes.
They won't tell me. Although Henry was interested in astrology, he wasn't, or doesn't seem to have been, unduly bothered by magic, which the third had been, because he accused John Morton of trying to poison him with magic.
Yep.
During the Buckingham Rebellion, 1483, Morton was accused of employing the necromancer Thomas Nandike. And more of him in a cameo episode. In contrast to Richard's apparent fear of sorcery, Henry VII adopted a more phlegmatic approach to the magical plots against him. He even pardoned the Grand Prior of the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem, John Kendall, for his part in the magic ointment round the doorframe plot.
Still the most ridiculous way to assassinate somebody ever.
Well, maybe Henry just thought, no, that's just funny. I'm not kidding.
Oh, this is even dumber than, what was the episode where a Scottish king was killed by a statue?
Yes.
Shot him with an arrow, and Allie was like, why wouldn't you just stab me?
Yes.
How about an ointment over the door?
And it wasn't even the same ointment that they was given, was it? It was a different ointment. It was in Henry VIII's reign that we see the entry into England of the sort of humanist teachings of people like Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola and Renaissance magic. Although most English books throughout the 16th century remained largely stuck in medieval traditions of magic. It was thought that Wolsey must have used magic to keep his position of unrivalled power, since what other explanation could there be? And same for Anne Boleyn. I mean, surely she must have been a witch. Surely.
Oh, yes. With her sixth finger.
Well, to get back to the Arundel manuscript, that picture I sent you of them all huddled there in a tiny little space, it contains an image of Henry VII seated on the throne, listening to the predictions of his astrologers, surrounded by his courtiers.
Doesn't look like Henry.
No, he's looking very young and benign, isn't he? He looks like, he reminded me of a sort of Ladybird book of what a good king should be.
Yes.
And we know who some of these people are.
Just leave that in. Everybody will just be waiting. Do we? Are we sure?
I said that, and I suddenly realised actually the next paragraph doesn't tell us. Yes, it does. I've just read on. It's obvious that Henry is acting on these astrological predictions with the full backing of both the state and the church. And the support of the state is shown by the man standing next to Henry.
Oh, holding the sword?
Holding the sword of state, yes.
Okay.
And he is either the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Thomas Lovell, or Thomas Stanley, who held the sword during the coronation.
If it's Thomas Stanley, they look the same age.
I don't think you can go much by... This is a medieval picture.
Yeah.
It's, I mean, they all look...
Young.
Yes, I can't imagine any of them actually looked like that.
Except for the miniature person in the bottom left.
I think he might be a jester. He's not very important, I don't think, because he's small.
Yes. Yeah.
And small.
The dog is bigger than he is. The dog is more important.
Yeah, well, he is in a way, because it's a greyhound, and that was one of the emblems of the Tudors, wasn't it?
Yes. Why a greyhound? I'd pick a Great Dane. Or an English Mastiff. For one thing, it's an English Mastiff.
Yes. There's another little dog you can see just in front. I was going to mention this at the end. He's got a little bit of fur shaved off his ear.
I was going to ask.
Now, I don't know why that is.
Well, it looks like his back and his tail
seems
has
nobody
been
knows
shaved.
why that is. It doesn't seem to be. I mean, you might just think it was a bit of the paint scraped away or, you know, perhaps that dog had just had an operation or something. But apparently there are other manuscripts that have dogs with little bits shaved off them. There's one in Aachen and one in Munich.
Oh.
And nobody's sure what it signifies.
Oh.
So if anybody knows, let us know. The support of the church is shown by the fact on Henry's other side there's an archbishop.
Yes.
And that's almost certainly John Morton.
Ah.
And he's pointing to the stars in a sort of, it's all going on up there type way. William Parran, the astrologer royal, is kneeling behind the man in the forefront on the right.
Right.
And behind Parran, and peering over his shoulder, wearing what looks like a sweatband,
Yeah.
that's Giovanni Gigli.
How do we know?
I think, well, people have done a lot more work on this manuscript than I have. And there is historical reason for thinking so.
Okay.
It could be entirely wrong. It could be that the people have got completely the wrong end of the stick. But this is the story most people want going with. The man kneeling on the right in the foreground and appearing to hand the book to Henry has a shield with the arms of Louis of Orleans.
Oh.
So did Louis commission the book and give it to Henry?
Oh.
It had been suggested that that was the case. This was the time when Louis and Henry were on the same side trying to protect Brittany from France. Mm-hmm. So that would make it a possibility, except that between 1488 and 1491, Louis was a prisoner and hardly in a position to commission books. Mm-hmm. Or it has been suggested that the kneeling man in the front is Robert Gagin, whom we came across a couple of times. He was the French ambassador who got into a rap battle or fighting with Bernard André, Giovanni Gigli, and I seem to remember Adriano Castellesi was there too. Gagin had come to the English court for several reasons. To get support for Charles VIII's claim to Naples, to recognise the dissolution of the marriage between Anne of Brittany and Maximilian, so that Charles could marry her,
Right.
and to sue for peace.
Yes.
But he was so infuriated by this rap battle, which he'd actually started, that he stormed off in rage, and Henry said that they must prepare for war. So it's madness. He came on a peace mission.
And he started a fight.
Very annoyed with Andre, and now they're preparing for war.
Oh, gosh. In a fit of pique, he storms off.
Yes.
And the next thing you know, millions of people are dying. Well, thousands.
Yeah. Well, in fact, not, but we know, but he could have done.
Ridiculous.
I read that if Gagin's mission had backfired in the way it seemed to, since Henry did invade France a couple of years later, why would this meeting have been recorded in a picture showing the handing over of a book, as we have in this picture, the Arundel manuscript? But we have other theories about this so-called invasion of Henry's. So just to go even deeper into the idea that Charles and Henry had concocted the whole thing as a ruse for Henry to get money and Charles to get Henry out of his hair while he went to Italy, could Gagin have been our mystery intercessor? Because we suggested Reginald Bray,
Yes.
Roger Machado, or Christopher Erswick.
Yes.
Maybe it was Gagin.
Well, maybe it was both, all of them together. They never seem to do it by just one person and one person.
Yeah.
Groups.
The picture showing the gift of a book could have been a smokescreen for Gagin's real mission.
It's not this book. The book, actually, if you move one page, it's just a hole with a whole bunch of money in it.
Yes. Well, Andre and Gigli wouldn't have known his real reason for being there, so they wouldn't have had any problem about insulting him in verse, making him storm back to France. Was he really there to negotiate the fake war by which Henry could go to France, wave his sword about, get other people to wave theirs, and then come home with lots of money? Mm-hmm. Well, maybe. It's pure conjecture.
Who knows?
And the kneeling man, is it Gagin? Because he has a full head of hair and Gagin was a cleric, so should have been tonsured. Although we have heard bishops, particularly Morton, complain that the clergy should cut their hair. So
Yes.
lazy cleric?
Maybe.
Two sources I read had different views on what's happening in this picture. One said that Henry was being given the manuscript by the French ambassador, as we just looked at, but the other said that Henry was showing the book to the ambassador.
Oh. Like, look, I know what's going to happen.
Yeah, it's been predicted.
Mm-hmm.
So, don't bother changing things because it has been predicted. So what was going on at this time? In the 3 years prior to 1490, there had been a truce between England and France. In January of that year, it was due to expire. It was unlikely it would be renewed since the previous year Henry had signed the Treaty of Redon, throwing in his lot with Anne of Brittany. Charles VIII, or rather Anne de Beaujeu, who was acting as regent for Charles, sent 2 ambassadors to London, one of whom was Robert Gagin, to negotiate a truce of perpetual peace. Morton gave the English response to this offer. He said that the king followed the example of Christ and was always devoted to peace, but, quote, peace is not always possible unless violence and quarrelling have ceased. Well, you'd think that was the definition of peace, but anyway.
Yeah.
Therefore, the king of the Gauls ought first to return to our king the things which are his, and then petition for peace, unquote. In other words, we want our territories in France back.
Yeah.
And it must surely have been obvious that Charles VIII wouldn't accept this, so effectively Henry was declaring war. Innocent VIII was all for peace between France and England, not necessarily for Christian motives, thou shalt not kill, but if France and England were tied up with fighting each other, they weren't in a position to fight the Turks. So the date John Wellies gives to the compilation of this manuscript falls within the time that the peace negotiations were taking place.
Right.
Meanwhile, Henry was negotiating with Maximilian, a pact against the French, because they're all devious. And he was signing the Treaty of Medina del Campo with Ferdinand and Isabella, which also committed him to an anti-French stance. Some of the prophecies in Henry's bumper book of astrology concerned Edward III, as he claimed the French throne through his mother Isabella, a claim he reckoned was superior to Richard VI of Valois. So if Henry is showing this text to the French ambassador, was he pointing out this section? Look, it is written, I have a claim to the French crown, and I'm going to take it. Unless I'm paid not to, but you didn't hear that from me. And also a claim to the throne through the female line, like Edward III, would have had resonances with Henry.
Yes.
The prophecies of Birgitta of Sweden that make up the last book of the manuscript urged Philip VI to adopt Edward III and so bring peace between the two countries that way. I don't think the manuscript was suggesting that Charles VIII adopt Henry VII. But if that's what it would take to get Henry off his back so he could go to Italy, I should think Charles would have been up for it, wouldn't he?
Maybe. He was very single-minded about that.
He certainly was. Another prophecy in the manuscript concerning Edward III goes as follows, quote, "The lilies will decay, but England will bloom. Under him the initial freedom of the church will return. Babylon will fear him, for he will grind all enemies of the cross. Acre and Jerusalem, saved by leopard's power, will rejoice at their return to the cult of the faith. The hermit will receive the empire of the world." It sounds like gibberish,
yes.
but...
Yes, it does.
This is all about how Edward III, the leopard...
I thought you were going to say leper.
Leopard, as in the symbol for England, 3 leopards, that we now erroneously call the 3 lions.
Yep.
He reconquered Gascony, the lilies of Gaul, with the help of Flanders. So you can easily see how Henry could spin that to mean he reconquers the land of Charles VIII with the help of Maximilian. And then the bit about grinding all the enemies of the cross would be Innocent VIII banging on about the Crusades against the Ottomans. And Henry could easily have been showing this passage to the French ambassador, pointing out how it all fits together so nicely that it must surely be a premonition. So go home and tell your king about that. We've no way of knowing whether such a meeting, such as depicted in this manuscript, ever took place. But a look at the international situation makes this picture of all these people huddled round the king take on a political slant and shows how the political and astrological could be so intertwined. I really enjoyed researching this manuscript because that group of nondescript people, you could suddenly think, it's Giovanni Gigli, we know him.
Yeah.
And it drags in Brittany, Charles in Italy.
Puts them all together.
Louis XII.
Yeah.
Rat battle.
Rat battle.
Yeah.
I love the fact that there was a rat battle.
Richard Fitzjames. Parron. And it does what I hope this podcast would do. It links all these people in ways that we wouldn't expect.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's it. That's Henry's book of astrology. Well, actually, having said that, it's sort of focused on mainly on one page of it.
Yeah, but it's beautiful.
It is a lovely book.
Interesting. Very cool.
Yeah, I can't imagine for 1 second that any of the people in that picture look like the way they've been portrayed. I mean, the picture of Giovanni Gigli, and I've put this picture up on our website, he looks like somebody sneaked in someone from the 80s.
Yes. Yes, very much.
Yeah, someone doing the restoration has thought, I wonder if anyone will notice this. Stuck him in.
I am surprised at how many people in the painting don't have hats on.
Yeah.
Because that's not really polite.
Or was it, were you meant to take your hat off in the presence of the king? Unless you had a special hat, like the bishop or someone.
I don't know.
One that went with your position.
And the jester's not wearing a jester's hat. In my opinion, that's not a jester's hat.
If that's who it is, it's a small person of insignificance.
Yes, that's always the weirdest thing, where they make people a different size depending on how much power they had.
Henry, I'm trying to think, Henry does look bigger than the rest of them. I'm not sure about...
Morton, the bishop.
Morton, he looks quite big, but the rest of them, the ones kneeling...
Are all...
But that might be the difficulty of getting someone
the perspective right at the same time as changing people's size. Henry's all in cloth of gold with crimson embroidery. God, that had to have been heavy.
Oh, hot.
And expensive
Really hot.
as soon as you sit down, because it actually folds the metal. You end up with permanent creases in the metal.
I wonder if it digs into you.
Oh, it can't be comfortable. Except he does have quite a bit of fur in between him and, well, at least the big robe. That ermine robe.
It must have been such a liability being a king. The things that were expected of you, you might have well have thought, oh, I just don't want to be bothered with that.
Yes. I don't want to talk to people today.
No.
Send them away.
I don't want to put that on.
I get a headache. This crown's heavy.
Yeah. And that sword is huge.
It is big.
That must be incredibly heavy to be standing there, having a picture drawn, holding it in one hand.
Yes, can you please draw this first? And work everything else around it.
And then I'll just hold a little stick, and you can take my hand. Okay, anyway. We seem to have stopped talking, which is not good for a podcast.
We'll cut it out. As we're all thinking. That's the end of our episode on Henry's Book of Astrology. We hope you enjoyed it.
And next time it's...
Someone. Could be anything.
We do have a list, but it gets changed a lot.
Yes. Thank you for listening.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.